Jag väldigt möchte beherrschen müssen wo steht dem auch Wochen haben dann müsst du jeder so ja so seine eigene erste Leute ist das mal
Well, buried nuts the most. Buried nuts the most.
they're talking too much. I have to jump in and be like, right guys, let's start. Which I had to do the other day for Gary Neville. It's like, you guys ready? It was similar to the Matt Hancock one when they were like arguing and I was just there like
Genuinely,
Just all total rubbish.
no. I've not even asked the question yet. There needs to be boundaries. You want to go.
No.
and he didn't listen. I went over to him, I was like, you can't do that, no, stop. I just heard Mo Gowda being like, can I do anything about it?
Can I do something about it? This
Yeah,
question.
that one plays over in my head a lot. Go back to the Jordan Peterson when he like before he started crying, you could just like feel it coming.
But it's almost unbearable.
Just being really honest now.
Dream a reality.
Concept of this channel is to speak to people, and I want to understand their behind the scenes. I want to understand their dream. I want to understand how they got to where they got to, which is the reality. The reason why I wanted to speak to Jack Sylvester is because this podcast that he's directing and producing, which is The Diary of a CEO, they have the biggest guests on in the world. I wanted to understand, how do you get to that stage? What it actually looks like behind the scenes.
Jack Sylvester, the director and producer of one of the biggest podcasts in the world. How do you feel about that title?
Yeah, it's pretty nuts to be fair. I was just actually looking on my phone to see if we are still ahead of Joe Rogan, and we are, which is good. Another one seems to be at the top of the road, but we won't talk about them. Yeah, it's pretty crazy to be fair. I started doing this thing kind of in my parents' basement, and then it's grown into this, so it's pretty cool. And yeah, I feel very privileged to have people like yourself asking me to come on podcasts. I'm usually behind the camera.
One of the things that Anthony says, who is the trailer editor, Jack always taught me to add the 1% extra. What do you mean by that?
So we have this ethos in the team. I think it originally came from not Steve Peters, Sir David Brailsford. And it's all about finding the 1%. I think a lot of people go into something thinking they need to get 100% better or 50% better or anything like that. But it's all about finding those marginal gains. That's what he calls it, marginal gains. And it's about all these tiny little aspects that then add up to your 100%. So it's things like, for example, I put this video on. I saw that the light was a bit harsh on my face. I put a little diffuser over it to make it like less harsh, and then that makes it a little bit better. You probably wouldn't notice as a viewer. You might not notice if the light was harsh or if it was less harsh, but all those tiny little things add up. So again, another example would be this microphone. I wouldn't have a microphone. You could argue that the lighting in the microphone is a bit more than 1%, but it's about making all those tiny little things. Another thing, before we started, I got myself a water. I just might actually get some water. I turned off these lights so you don't have mixed lighting, and you have one light. You have like the cool lighting rather than the warm lighting. One thing I probably should have done is plug my laptop in, because now I probably have to disrupt the conversation and get a charger later. But it's about like, I'll figure that out next time, and next time I'll put a charger in, and that will make the conversation 1% better, because it will mean I don't have to get up. And then when I bring in a new team member, I'll give them the same thing. I'll say, look, we've got to find those 1%. Don't make it 100% better each time. Don't be like, I've got to be like that guy. You're never going to be Usain Bolt straight away, but you've got to put in all those little marginal gains. Maybe like you got to try your trainers, you got to sleep better, you got to eat better, and it's all about finding those things. And so yeah, whenever we bring in a new team member, I'll tell them that on their first day. I'll be like, don't try and get 100%, get the 1%. And that's really what I mean by that. So that's really stuck with Ant, because I've heard him mention it quite a lot. So he either changes his colors, or he does more sound effects, or he will talk to people or research more stuff. And I think one of his posts was the session at the beginning of when he started working for us and now, and it's crazy. But that was a progression. That wasn't then and now. It was a huge progression. So you get there by implementing those tiny little improvements every time you partake on a task.
I think one of the things I really was interested in, especially from a journey point of view, I think people underestimate sort of the timing of everything. Now, I think one quintessential question is probably to do with how did you end up in your role? Because I think a lot of people feel like they would love to be in your position, but I don't feel like people understand what it takes to get there. And I think you can't necessarily be lucky. You have to be prepared for the luck. How did you go with Huel? How did you start working with them?
Yeah, so it kind of all started from when I left uni. Basically, I did a bit of traveling, and I've got this camera, and I figured out you could just film stuff and put it on YouTube, and I did that a little bit. I put a lot of like my travel films on, and that was good fun, and that got me in good stead to know how to use a camera. And then when I got back, I was like, I'm gonna make a business out of this. I know I can do that. So I went on these freelance websites like Upwork and all that kind of stuff. I had a huge background in audio, so I used that as my leverage to get onto video. You have an audio guy or a video guy. Very rarely they know a lot about both. So I was trying to use that as leverage whilst learning how to do video. So I put myself up on these freelance websites as a guy that can film, but he knows audio. He's an audio guy, so he can do your podcast, but he can also film as well. One day, I got a message from a lady called Lauren, and yeah, she wanted me to record the podcast, and it was a bit of luck to start with, because Huel headquarters are where my parents are based in Buckinghamshire. And I was apparently the only person for miles, but I was trying to build my production business out of my parents' basement. I remember spending hours down there, and it would be really nice on a day like today because it was always so cold. It was always so cold. But yeah, I'd spend hours down in this dark, dingy basement, trying to get my foot in the door. And I love the YouTube space. So I was always trying to position myself with creators. And then yeah, I got this one with Huel. I was the only person for miles. And yeah, Steve liked me and he brought me on. His videographer left him, and I think Lauren was looking for someone to film it. So she asked if I could do it, and I was like, yeah, sure. I remember her being really nervous as well because she hadn't experienced someone doing both before. So I just kept positioning myself as a video and audio guy.
And I remember one time you said you received a message from Steven, I think on WhatsApp, and he messaged you that
Yeah.
I'm going to be leaving Social Chain, which is at the time and still now probably one of the biggest marketing agencies in the world. And he's going to pursue this podcast thing full time, and he wants to be
Yeah.
a big thing from a production point of view. And he asked if you could join. So, what time did he send that message, and where were you when you received that text, and what did you react like?
Let me find the message. So he sent it at 12:09. I think I told people that it was like 3 a.m. I think the time probably changes. But it was at 3:09. He asked me, what are you doing work-wise at the moment? I said, I'm pretty busy in the next couple of weeks. But after that, I'm free. And then he went, okay, I'm moving to London. I've resigned from Social Chain. My last day is the 15th of August. I've rented this place and I want to film pretty much full time. Are you in? I just replied, wow, didn't see that one coming. That's well cool. Yeah, I'm down. Sounds exciting. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I woke up, so I replied to that at sort of, I think it was 7 a.m. the next day when I woke up. I remember turning to my partner at the time and just being like, Steve just messaged me. And he's just asked me if I want to do this. And it was weird because I very rarely spoke to Steve. It was always through Lauren, his manager before she actually left, before he left Social Chain. But it was always through her or his team. So I very rarely spoke to Steve. And then, yeah, that was why that message was really weird at the time. But yeah, I remember just being really confused and kind of shocked that he'd asked me, to be fair. I'd done a lot of work for them in the past. I remember one time, actually, this is probably because he hasn't really said why before, but there's one time that sticks in my mind of probably why he decided to go for me was when they asked me to edit a video, edited it for them, and then I had to go pick my girlfriend up from the airport. So I was on the way to the airport. It was about an hour's drive. I took my laptop with me just in case. And this his team messaged me like, oh, it's not right, we need to change the colors or something. So as soon as I got to the airport, I got my laptop out and like changed it, did all this whilst waiting for my girlfriend. I sent it to them and they sent it to Steve for approval, and it was all this kind of thing, but I was basically doing it on the move. And I think he finds that stuff valuable, like when something's needed and you can be relied on. I think it gets it's the reliability. I've found it when bringing team members on, that reliability is so valuable, and it's just something I don't think you can really pay for very often. So are you talking about the original set or the brand new set?
I think I'm talking about the brand new set that cost around 40 grand, if that's the one.
Okay, so that was the first set.
Oh, interesting. So that's even, so presumably the second set cost more?
A lot more, yeah. I actually don't know the number of the second one, but it was a lot more. So yeah, the first set was, most of that cost was into cameras and equipment, because we recorded it in Steve's kitchen, kitchen/dining room. So it was about turning that place into a usable podcast space. So we bought cameras, microphones, stands, lighting, all this kind of stuff, lenses. And yeah, it went up to about 40K. What the interviewers do is they have a set of questions and they need to hit that set of questions. And they ask the one question, the person will answer it, I'll go to the next one, I'll go to the next one, I'll go to the next one. But what they don't do, and what a really good interviewer I think does, is really listen to what the person's saying and develop on that, rather than trying to rattle off their questions, because that's where you get the conversation flowing. Is that a set of questions?
Yes.
Yeah.
Sure.
That's where you get the conversation flowing. So I might say something that you've never heard before, and then you go, okay, cool, and you go on to your next question. Whereas like if I say or allude to something that you've never heard before, for example, I think before the thing got cut off, we're talking about the studio. I've never spoken about the studio before, apart from being online. But if I said, oh, we've got a new studio, and you go, oh, cool, and you go on to your next question about, I don't know, Joe Rogan and Steve being similar, that's gone then. Whereas if you said like, so you say you got a new studio, like, oh, tell me more about that, and then it develops more of a conversation. And I think actually conversations are what makes Steve and Joe so prevalent in the space. Is they're doing conversations, they're not doing interviews. It's like an interview to an extent, but it's flowing. And I think it's the lack of flow that creates a bad interviewer, in my opinion. One thing is like being comfortable with the silence. That's maybe with Steve more prevalent than it would be with Joe, because we have like emotional moments where we talk to the guest, and Steve, like, he'll just let the silence sit because the person's thinking about something. It's like the Jordan Peterson one. I don't know if you've seen that, but Steve just lets it sit and Jordan just starts talking again. Or like the Nike CMO, Greg Hoffman, a similar thing happened there. So it's all these different things, but I think listening is a really key factor of being a really good interviewer. And then being knowledgeable about certain areas, doing your research, which I think you've done your research from what I can see. You've done a good job from what I can see.
Behind the scenes, what makes a good director? What's the difference between a good director and then a great director?
So I don't know. I've not been around a lot of directors, but I would say from my point of view, what I find helps me and what from people I've taken great inspiration from, it's just like understanding every element of the space. Not even if it's like to a great level, but just understanding a little bit of it. Because people come up to me all the time and just say, oh, so we'll record tomorrow and we'll get the episode out the next day. I'm like, no, it doesn't work like that, because there's all these steps throughout the process and you need to do that. So I think, especially when you start bringing in a team, it's like, so if I had someone doing the audio, someone doing the video, and someone editing, I know a little bit about each one of those areas so that I can almost sympathize with each one of those areas. I think that's probably what would make a really good director in the podcast space as that stands. It from just a bird's eye view, it looks very simple, and you don't understand what things you need to put in place to make the process either easier, to make that person easier, or what time you need to get the finished product completed. That would be, in my opinion, what makes a great director.
I know I'm always mentioning Steve, and this is about you, not Steve. But I think to see the growth alongside him and yourself, I think that is important to highlight, because I think a lot of people always probably say to themselves, oh, I was in that position, I would do amazing too. I think one of the things that people don't realize is that there is a lot of hard work, and I think there's a lot of growth. I think that person who studied at university or college doing music production to now talking about hiring, recruiting, trying to look over people's different issues, and the way you talk to someone is different to someone else because personalities differ. That's something I think you've grown alongside Steven. So what are 3 things from a business perspective, management side of things, that you've probably learned from Steven and applied into your own team?
I think the 1% marginal gains thing that we spoke about at the beginning would definitely be one of them. I think building the culture is something we talk about a lot, and creating like a really solid culture, I think, is, I've seen in big corporate companies and companies that my friends work for, that the culture is very overlooked. And I think if you don't put a really good culture in place, all the other things tend to suffer. So I think we have a really good culture here, which makes me want to come to work, which makes me want to do a really good job, which makes me want to turn up and do the best I can generally, because I like enjoy coming into work. And I think when you go into these big corporate companies, they don't have a culture and you're just a number. No one enjoys coming into work. They're going there to do the job. They're going there to for their 9 to 5, just for the paycheck. Whereas if you're doing that, things generally aren't going to get better. Whereas if I really, really care about the podcast, I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure every element is as good as it could be. And I think that stems from the culture of it being a nice place to work. If I didn't enjoy doing the podcast, I don't think I would care about those elements. So I think the basis of a great business is a great culture. I think hiring is something we talk about a lot, and how important it is to hire really good talent, but also someone that's really dedicated and is going to show up. And that like is a culture fit as well. That's really important, and that's something I've learned. You asked me for 3, but I'm probably going to give you more. Watch me say this one, and I won't think of any more after I've said that. Making people feel valued, and making people's work feel valued, and knowing what that means to them. So one person, it might mean like buying them a little gift, or another person it might mean like doing something nice for them, or just sending a message. It's all these different things, and that makes people feel valued. That probably plays into the culture bit a bit as well.
Now, I think one of the reasons why you guys are where you are is because of the guests. Now, I think the difference between a good podcast and the difference between a great podcast is more than just the guest. I think it comes down to captivating the audience. Again, we all live in a society where we have TikTok, where we have Instagram Reels, YouTube Shorts just released last year, where they're trying to captivate people through the short-term content, which is probably the antithesis of what a long-form podcast would be. Why do you feel like a podcast would be something that people would rather prefer watching than short-form content?
Similar to like what BBC do. BBC are like click, 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 like you were saying before. And I think what podcast offers is something that people are kind of hungry for and aren't really getting. TikTok's great for being on the bus and flicking through or whatever, or like, you know, just here and there content. But podcasts are really like probably yearn on our like deepest human needs for like intimacy and connection, all that kind of stuff. It gives context, and it's not something you really get that much these days. So someone said something to me about if podcasts will ever go, and it was generally podcasts are the modern campfire conversation. Be nice, because campfire conversations have been happening for as long as humans have been able to talk to each other. I assume, and I think it's the modern version of that. So I think it's really ingrained in us. I think that's probably why people love it so much.
Do you act towards someone who maybe you've seen online and are very nervous? Do you feel like you approach them a little bit differently?
Yeah, definitely. I get a gauge when they sit down. I get a gauge of what they're like, how they're like in front of the camera, what the general vibe is like. Sometimes they'll sit down and there's a bit of like preamble before they start talking. So I'm actually in the guest chair now. But so Steve will be on that side and he'll be talking and saying a little bit of stuff, whilst I'm like doing the setting up of the camera, of the tripod heights and all that stuff. And if I can sense the conversation's not flowing and it needs to get in, I'll hurry everything up and I'll just get it going as quick as possible, because otherwise there's an uncomfortable conversation in the room. That's very rarely happens, but it tends to happen. It's happened once when we were in LA, and it was just a bit awkward in the room before the podcast started. So that kind of situation, I would be like, get everything rushed, and I'd approach that a bit differently if the person's not super comfortable. So one of the things I do with this mic is they have to get super close. Like if you get really close here, I don't know if you use this recording, but it generally sounds better. Whereas if I like go all the way back here, I'm gonna fall off my chair soon, but if I go all the way back here, it won't sound as good. So I always try and get them really close to the mic. And that makes people feel really uncomfortable sometimes because they're not used to a mic so close to their face. We don't use headphones, which Rogan does, and I think that's why people like being close to the mic, because you can hear yourself. But that I would change things like that sometimes. I would maybe push it away a bit or get them to feel more comfortable and bring the mic to them. It's all these little things. Generally, I'm quite lucky and they're all quite comfortable. But as my first port of call is to make sure they're comfortable, and then I'll make sure the production's good. Because if they're not comfortable, the interview won't be good. So, yeah.
That was interesting. I didn't realize that as a director, you can have the power to kind of speed things up based upon the vibe of the room. Do you feel like you are responsible for the vibe? Do you feel like you're responsible for the flow of the conversation?
We do certain things before the person even walks in to try and get a good vibe in here. So I guess as like a team, not necessarily me on my own, I'm in charge of the vibe, but like, so we put music on, we make sure there's someone outside to greet them so they feel like welcomed, and we'll like chat to them before they start recording, and we'll ask them a bit about their day or how they got here. We'll make it smell nice in here. We usually have the aircon on. As you can see today, it's not working and I'm very hot. And yeah, we do little things like that to try and make them feel a bit more comfortable. But yeah, it's more of a team effort than me individually. But then when they sit down in this chair, then I think it is my responsibility to make sure they feel okay. I'll let them know that we can stop if they need to go to the toilet or need a glass of water. I'll make sure they are comfortable. So I guess it's all things like that. And I'll gauge if the guest and Steve are talking, I'll let it play out so they feel comfortable with each other. And then I'll jump in. If they're talking too much, I have to jump in and be like, right, guys, let's start this now. Which I had to do the other day for Gary Neville when he was on. I was like, you guys ready? Because we need to start. And they were just chatting away. So yeah, I guess when they sit in the chair, then that's 100% my responsibility. And Steve's as well, I guess.
That's a lot of social intelligence that I didn't realize you needed, to be honest. So, fair play to that. And I've seen the Gary Neville podcast, but for you personally, what are the 3 guests that you feel like you'd love to have them back on? Or, in fact, let me retrench that. What are the 3 guests that you feel like are the most memorable for you?
Oh, I love this question because I always say my answer and people recoil when I say my answer. So I'll go from the top. I'll go from the third to the first. So I'd say probably third, isn't it? Jordan Peterson sits in my head as probably there, just because it's like Jordan Peterson. He's this huge anomaly that people either love or hate, and you see he's like one of those guys that you'll put on a thumbnail just to get views, even though the video is not about him. Like that's that kind of person you're dealing with here. So that was a really cool one. That felt like a really nice one. We'd love to have him back on. The second one would probably be Matt Hancock. And that's the one where everyone reels back and they're like, why is he saying Matt Hancock?
Is it because of the expectation of his reality? Sorry, because he actually becomes a bit more human.
It's probably less about him as a person, and it's more that what that conversation did for us as a platform. So the way it positioned us as a platform, not as just a podcast where we interview CEOs, it positioned us as a platform where conversations happen. And that's really where we're trying to play, is a place where conversations happen and you go to the pub and you talk to your mate about it. And we're not trying to get your buzzy, clicky headlines or anything like that. We're just having a conversation and we're letting the viewer make up their mind. So that felt like a really big moment in my career and in the podcast career, just because it shifted us from a podcast to a place where conversations happen. And I love that. I love that. So that would probably be one of my favorites, just purely because of that reason, not because of the actual guest, but where that conversation positioned us. And then my first one would have to be Mo Gaudat, which everyone in the team says is their favorite, because it just changed your perspective on so many different areas of your life. I was driving back to my parents. I was on the motorway and I got caught by a speed camera. And I was just remember being like, oh my God, I can't believe it. And then I just heard Mo Gaudat being like, can I do anything about it? If no. And it was just like, oh, okay, fine. And I got over it in that moment. And yeah, that one plays over in my head a lot. First time he came on, second time was good too. But yeah, first one was a fantastic episode. That's why I tell everyone to start. I'm like, 101, episode 101, go there.
In the room, when you're behind the cameras, do you feel like you experience the conversation just like a viewer, or do you think you have an enhanced version?
Definitely enhanced. Definitely enhanced. You feel it in the room. You really feel it.
Sure.
We had someone's PR sit here the other week. It said it was amazing being in the room because they just like felt the conversation. And they're like, it's not like anything you experience just listening to the conversation. You can like feel I'll go back to the Jordan Peterson when he like, before he started crying, you could just like feel it coming. I don't know what it was. It was just this like sense, and you're there like on the edge of your seat. It was similar to the Matt Hancock one when they were like arguing, and I was just there like, you're just there, just hanging on to the conversation. Yeah, you definitely get enhanced feeling for sure.
What makes those conversations so good and how do you become a good conversationalist? Is it the genuinity behind when someone speaks, as you said, listening, actually, rather than me looking at my book, trying to figure out what's the best questions to ask, I should actually hold on, let me listen to him and see if there's something that I could relate with or just really want to know about. So what do you think makes a good conversation? How do you become a good person to talk to?
Doing your research. So if it's on a book, say you have an expert on, actually like reading the book, because we get all these experts in, and some of them will finish the interview and they'll be like, oh, I can actually tell you read that book. I do so many interviews and it's clear to me that they haven't read the book. So I think doing your research and actually making the person feel valued is probably quite critical as well. Because if you come in, you start interviewing them and it's like, take me through your book then. It's like, well, why don't you read it and then talk to me about the book? It probably just makes them feel a bit rubbish.
Sure. No, fine.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah, I think there's
question.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think there's a lot of overlapping questions I've asked, and I think it's because I'm very interested in sort of the authenticity of your conversations, because I think there's a lot of podcasts, Jack, and the reason why you guys are where you are at is because, again, the overlapping statements are true. You don't need to have something revolutionary or something sort of out of the box. In fact, if you just go back to the simplicity of things, we just have a conversation, capture the emotions, keep it simple, then I think you can do well. So how does a typical podcast day look like for the Diary of the CEO? That wasn't a quick fire question, was it? That was literally like you can answer that for hours.
It varies, yeah. So sometimes we'll do 2 podcasts in a day. We've done 3 before. We do 2. So it looks like I turn up before anyone else. I make sure everything's rolling, like all the cameras are good, all the positions are good, lighting's good, audio sounds good. I'll do that generally. I'll arrive an hour before, because we have the privilege of being able to like keep everything up, and as it is quite good. But generally, so there's no like setup, but I'll turn up about an hour before. I'll make sure everything's okay. I'll make sure the fuel's nice and cold. Yeah, just do all stuff like that. Make sure the cameras are working properly. And then obviously do the record. I make sure people are behaving themselves behind the scenes. So if the other day we had Liver King on, and he brought his videographer with him, his videographer was taking photos throughout, but it was like a shutter one, click sound every time he did it. And I told them before, I said, you can't move around and you can't take photos on that, take it on your phone. And he didn't listen. I went over to him, I was like, you can't do that. But like, obviously we were in a recording, so I was like, no, stop. So it's a little bit, it's like that. That's what happens. Maybe if there's lots of PR here and they're talking, I'm like, come on, let's go. Let's, because we have allotted time with these guys. These guys are very busy. So it'll be stuff like that.
What's one thing you probably dislike about Steve and one thing you like about Steve?
Dislike about Steve. Oh, how long you got? I'm joking. The one thing I really like about Steve, I only allowed to say one. I like how ambitious he is, but that's probably the thing I hate at the same time. Yeah, I mean, I love it because it's great and it helps us get where we need to go and things get put in place to help us get there. But you also hate it at times because you're like, oh, come on, we just sorted out that last issue and now we need to do this. But then you realize, and that's like a split-second thought, and then you're like, okay, let's do this. But then that's also something that's developed from me over time, whereas I don't have those thoughts as much as I did before. And I would say like it would probably have frustrated me to be like, just being really honest now, but it probably would have frustrated me to be like, we fixed one issue and then let's take it up a notch. And it's like, oh, but I've only just figured out how to do that. Whereas now it's like, okay, we've done this, let's take it up a notch. And I'm like, yeah, let's go, let's do it. So that's something that's developed, but that probably would have been something that I hated before, but I'm not sure I hate it that much anymore. Yeah, I think that's a.
Do you get hundreds of emails a day from Steven, I presume?
No, I don't. We don't. We chat on the podcast group, but I was just seeing if I had one from him then. Yeah, he'll message me, but generally he knows that and trusts that I will get the job done. When I say like ambitious stuff, it'll be like, right, we're gonna go 2 episodes a week type ambitious. We're gonna up the production, we're gonna start filming everything in 4K. That kind of, so it's not like a daily thing, it's more of like a upwards thing. Maybe the social team it's more of a daily thing. But yeah, for me it's a bit trickier to do stuff like that. But yeah. Thank you, mate. Appreciate it. And thanks for listening. Yeah, we love it. We love that we can bring these conversations to the world and we see the messages that everyone sends us. We have an impact chat where we can see how it's impacting people. And that's what's really important to us. And we love that we're making a difference in the world. So yeah, thanks for that and appreciate the kind words.